In the winter of 1943, as the Allies tightened their grip on North Africa, there existed a little-known administrative unit buried inside the British Special Operations Executive, Section 12B, a clerical pool tasked with supporting covert liaison between SOE and the rapidly expanding American Office of Strategic Services. Few outside Whitehall ever heard its name, and even fewer knew that its junior clerks often handled information far more sensitive than their rank suggested. Among them was a 23-year-old British signals specialist whose life would change the day he received unexpected transfer orders stamped "Urgent" forward to Mediterranean Command. Algiers in early 43 was a city in transition, part crossroads, part war laboratory. Streets crowded with French colonial administrators, Free French units reorganizing after Operation Torch, and American personnel still learning the rhythms of covert warfare. Into this mix stepped the young Aide, assigned to support a newly formed Anglo-American liaison office tucked into a requisitioned villa near the harbor. There he first heard the name he would come to know only as Rmml, a codename muttered more often with caution than familiarity. Officially, Lieutenant Colonel Rmml was attached to OSS Special Operations Branch, responsible for coordinating subversive activity in Axis-occupied Sicily. Unofficially, his reputation was that of a man who accepted risk others avoided. The aide's duties seemed innocuous at first, processing inbound field memos, typing coded dispatches, and maintaining the unit's classified paper chain. But he quickly learned that Rmml's operational style rarely aligned cleanly with protocol. He would disappear for days, returning with a stack of handwritten notes, scrawled maps of airstrips in western Sicily, lists of potential saboteurs, and brief statements about Italian coastal defenses. Some entries were precise, almost obsessively so. Others were conspicuously vague, as if major details had been intentionally omitted. The struggle for both the aide and the command staff was learning to work beside a man who operated at the edge of authorization. American officers admired Rmml's initiative. British supervisors worried about the consequences of freelance decision-making. Still, his results were difficult to ignore. Early OSS efforts to penetrate Sicily's communication lines owed much to his improvised networks. Local fishermen ferrying messages, clandestine meetings in the alleys behind Algiers' Casbah, and scheduled rendezvous with Free French naval officers. Yet each of these methods also carried risk. Axis agents were known to have infiltrated the region, and Allied command feared that one mistake could compromise months of covert groundwork. The aide's insight into these tensions came not from briefings but from paper, uncensored fragments passed across his desk. A diary excerpt found in a captured Italian officer's satchel read, "The enemy grows bold. Their agents are already in the villages near Sayaka. They move like shadows." Rmml later referenced this note during a late-night strategy meeting, tapping the table and remarking, "If they believe we're already there, then we must be twice as careful." It was the closest he ever came to acknowledging the real danger of premature exposure. Then came the first hint of mystery. In February, a courier aircraft, a Lockheed Hudson operated by the RAF's 117 Squadron, vanished during a routine hop between Algiers and Beaune. On board were several sealed pouches destined for Allied headquarters, including one labeled Rmml, Eyes Only. Official war diaries listed the aircraft simply as missing, whether suspected, yet the aide noted irregularities in the dispatch logs. The manifest he had typed reflected 2 pouches, not the 3 reported afterward. And eyewitness accounts from pilots flying that morning mentioned unusually clear skies, contradicting the weather explanation. The aide did not speak of his doubts, but he quietly began tracking discrepancies. Little things, signatures that didn't match perfectly, timestamps that seemed too close together, field notes referring to events out of sequence. None amounted to evidence, but together they formed a pattern he couldn't ignore. When he once attempted to question an OSS captain about the missing pouch, the officer replied only, "You'll find that in this theater, not every question has a safe answer." Still, the aide continued performing his duties with outward professionalism. He processed Rmml's mission outlines for pre-invasion reconnaissance of Sicily, plans involving U.S. 1st Infantry Division landing zones, RAF bomber routes, and covert observation teams positioned to report German troop movements. Each document that crossed his desk expanded his understanding of the coming operations scale. Yet the missing courier flight lingered in his thoughts, especially because Rmml never mentioned it, not even once. Looking back, the Aide would later write that this period taught him a lesson still relevant to modern intelligence work. Loyalty is not blind obedience. It is the ability to see clearly, to question where necessary, and yet to continue the mission. But at the time, he felt only a growing unease, an awareness that he was participating in something more complex than simple clerical work. As February turned to March, rumors of infiltration intensified. A Free French liaison officer warned staff that German WWII agents were operating within the port. And in the liaison villa, where maps covered every wall and telephones rang at all hours, the Aide began noticing Rmml watching him with a subtle, measuring glance, as if assessing how much the young clerk had already understood. By the end of Part 1, the Aide's sense of duty remained intact, but trust in the clarity of his mission had begun to erode. The vanishing aircraft, the mismatched documents, the silence surrounding Rmml's sealed pouch, these threads would soon pull him deeper into an operation where loyalties were tested, and where the truth was rarely written cleanly on the page. In the months leading up to Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily, a quiet war unfolded behind desks, radios, and sealed envelopes. For every battalion preparing to land on the island's beaches, there were teams of unseen men and women decoding messages, tracking couriers, and piecing together intelligence that could determine the fate of thousands. It was in this hidden world that the Aide began to confront a puzzle no one else seemed willing to acknowledge. Rmml's reports were growing increasingly inconsistent. At first, the discrepancies were subtle. An operation logged on the wrong date, a reconnaissance team referenced before it was assembled. But by late April, they were impossible to ignore. His days in the liaison villa had become a study in contrast. On the surface, tension was building across Algiers. American units gathered for briefings about the coming assault, British planners calculated German defensive strength, and OSS teams rotated in and out of the port, preparing networks that would activate once the invasion began. Yet inside the clerical office, the Aide worked alone much of the time, sorting through the flood of messages that Rmml deposited on his desk with little explanation. Some were carbon copies of field notes from agents embedded in Sicily, credible, detailed, and consistent with SOE assessments. Others, however, seemed strangely disconnected from known intelligence. A report dated April 18 described a German signals platoon moving toward Caltagirone, yet ultra-decrypts confirmed no such unit had been redeployed there. The struggle for the Aide was not deciphering the documents themselves. Years of signals training had prepared him well, but discerning Rmml's intentions. When he hesitated before typing a questionable note, Rmml would simply say, "File it. Headquarters will know what to make of it." But the Aide wasn't sure they would. And the uncertainty grew heavier after a courier plane vanished over the Mediterranean carrying one of Rmml's sealed pouches. The loss had been filed as a routine wartime disappearance. Yet the Aide had noticed that Rmml stopped referencing the contents of that pouch entirely, as if it had ceased to exist. Historical context only deepened the Aide's concerns. Both the SOE and OSS were still adapting to their partnership. Americans eager, aggressive, and often less encumbered by bureaucratic caution. The British experienced, meticulous, and wary of improvisation. The Aide saw these differences play out in the villa's narrow hallways daily. A senior SOE liaison once remarked during tea, "The Americans sometimes act before the ink is dry. That works in newspapers, less so in espionage." Rmml, however, seemed to operate on an entirely different axis, guided by his own sense of timing. Some colleagues viewed this as tactical brilliance. Others feared it bordered on recklessness. One evening, while sorting coded dispatches, the Aide uncovered a curious anomaly. A report from a coastal observer in Gela referenced a scheduled rendezvous between Allied agents and a Sicilian contact named Lupo. The Aide remembered seeing Lupo mentioned weeks earlier in a document suggesting the contact was already compromised. Yet the new report treated him as fully operational. When the Aide brought this up cautiously during a late-night review, Rmml studied him for a moment before offering a cryptic response. Some assets don't stay compromised for long. It was not an answer, but a warning to stop probing. His unease intensified when another irregularity emerged. The flight logs for the missing courier aircraft, supposedly lost in poor visibility, contradicted both RAF meteorological records and eyewitness accounts from the control tower. The skies were said to have been clear that morning. No storms, no mechanical distress calls, no debris recovered. But when the aide mentioned this to a visiting OSS captain, the man replied sharply, "Son, not every disappearance means foul play. In war, sometimes the sea just takes what it wants." Still, the aide could not dismiss the growing pattern. Mismatched dates, vague directives, agents listed as active despite earlier warnings, and a sealed pouch that no one seemed eager to discuss. He started keeping private notes, carefully coded, hidden in the lining of his uniform trunk. They were not accusations, merely observations he feared might otherwise vanish beneath the chaos of pre-invasion planning. Then came the reveal that shifted everything. A set of Rmml's field notes referenced a courier rendezvous near Tunis scheduled for May 3rd. But the aide knew the officer listed as attending that rendezvous had already been reassigned to Malta on April 29th. When he discreetly checked with Malta Command, they confirmed the officer had never left the island. Someone was wrong, but the aide could not determine if it was error, deception, or something in between. Modern analysts might view this situation as a lesson in the inherent fragility of intelligence systems. When uncertainty creeps in, even minor inconsistencies can cascade into operational risk. But for the aide living through it, the lesson felt more personal. Truth in wartime rarely arrives as a clean, verifiable statement. It emerges in fragments, in conflicting testimonies, in the silence between reports. By June, as Allied forces began final preparations for Operation Husky, the aide felt the villa's atmosphere shift. Officers worked longer hours, documents piled higher, and every conversation seemed fueled by a mixture of urgency and apprehension. Yet amid the rising pressure, Rmml remained composed, moving through briefings with almost eerie calm. And then, just as the aide began to accept the inconsistencies as part of the theater's chaos, a new sealed envelope arrived, bearing the same coded marking as the lost pouch. It was addressed to Rmml. But Rmml was nowhere to be found. In July 1943, as the first waves of Operation Husky surged toward the shores of Sicily, Allied High Command faced a challenge as old as warfare itself: how to see clearly through the fog of battle before the battle even began. Behind the beachheads and battalions, a covert struggle for intelligence dominance unfolded, one that would test loyalties, expose hidden risks, and draw the aide deeper into Rmml's shadow. The aide's role, once clerical, was becoming observational. And what he observed disturbed him. Rmml's methods, daring and effective, were growing increasingly opaque. The invasion of Sicily demanded unprecedented coordination. The U.S. 1st Infantry Division prepared to seize Gela. British forces under General Montgomery aimed for Pachino and Syracuse. And threaded between these movements were OSS and SOE sabotage teams tasked with crippling Axis command posts, intercepting communications, and fomenting local resistance. The aide watched these operations unfold through the documents he processed, reports referencing demolitions, clandestine insertions, and codes shared between agents operating behind enemy lines. Yet the struggle facing the aide was not the sheer volume of work. It was reconciling Rmml's official updates with the on-the-ground intelligence flowing in from SOE Section D and OSS Secret Intelligence. On July 9th, the eve of the landings, a coded message arrived describing a German signals unit near Lentini that had begun intercepting Allied radio traffic. Hours later, a second message contradicted it entirely, claiming the unit had moved west toward Caltanissetta. Rmml dismissed both reports with a shrug, saying only, "They'll be wherever we need them not to be." It was the kind of ambiguous confidence that unnerved the aide more than it reassured him. Insight came from an unexpected source. Among a stack of confiscated documents delivered from a captured Italian garrison was a fragment of a German field diary. One line stood out: Enemy operatives frequent the orchards near Rmml. Their signals are brief but resolute. The Aide recalled that an Allied sabotage team had been scheduled for insertion near the Rmml bridge, an area critical to the British 1st Parachute Brigade's advance. The correlation was alarming. If the Germans had identified the general area of Allied covert activity, the risk of compromise was extreme. When Rmml reviewed the fragment, his reaction was strangely muted. He tapped the page once, folded it, and placed it in his pocket without comment. Normally, such intelligence would be logged immediately and forwarded to Malta or Algiers. Instead, Rmml kept it. When the Aide hesitated, Rmml's gaze hardened just enough to signal that questions were unwelcome. Days later, the Aide learned the outcome. The entire Allied sabotage team operating near Rmml had vanished. No distress signals, no radio traffic, no trace of their equipment. The operation's failure was quietly noted in internal memos as presumed disrupted by enemy action. But the Aide knew the German diary line had been the only indication of danger, and that Rmml had withheld it. Why? To protect a source? To manipulate the flow of information? Or because the mission's risk had been deemed acceptable for reasons unknown? The reveal came during a late-night session in the liaison office. Rmml returned from a briefing carrying a worn map of eastern Sicily. As he laid it flat, the Aide noticed faint pencil marks, routes and timings that differed slightly from the versions officially circulated. Rmml's personal map indicated alternate rendezvous points for agents behind enemy lines, points no one else seemed to know about. The implication was undeniable. Rmml maintained an independent contact network within Axis-occupied Sicily. Whether sanctioned or self-generated, the Aide could not tell. A small notation in the map's margin caught his eye: Lupo. The same name he had seen in earlier conflicting reports. When he asked quietly, "Sir, is Lupo still reliable?" Rmml responded with a calm, unreadable expression. "In this business, reliability is only ever temporary." The answer chilled him more than any admission of danger could have. Modern intelligence officers might say such discrepancies reflect the inherent chaos of wartime espionage. But the Aide sensed something more deliberate at play. Each irregularity seemed woven into a pattern, one that suggested Rmml was orchestrating information, not merely gathering it. Perhaps he was attempting to shield certain assets. Or perhaps he was funneling intelligence through channels known only to him. The lesson, he would later write, was that wartime leadership often demands decisions made in moral gray zones. But in the moment, the Aide felt only the weight of uncertainty, an awareness that he was witnessing events without understanding the forces behind them. The closing days of July brought no clarity. Reports continued to contradict one another. OSS agents in Catania transmitted fragmentary signals before going silent. The British airborne forces fought desperately at Rmml, unaware of the covert failures behind them. And the Aide, sorting through the fallout, noticed that Rmml seemed increasingly distant, as though already operating on a level beyond the villa, beyond the official chain of command. By early August, as Allied forces solidified their hold on Sicily, the Aide realized the truth. The disappearance of the sabotage team was not an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern of omissions and ambiguities orbiting around Rmml himself. And the Aide had only begun to understand the cost. By late 1943, the Allied advance into mainland Italy brought with it a new kind of uncertainty, one that stretched beyond the battlefield and into the dimly lit rooms where intelligence officers worked tirelessly to decipher the shifting loyalties of a collapsing Axis regime. Naples, freshly liberated yet still scarred by German demolitions and shortages, became a magnet for covert operatives, informants, deserters, and opportunists. Into this volatile environment the Aide was transferred, assigned to process and decode material retrieved from abandoned SOE and OSS safehouses. But with each document he translated, his unease deepened. The shadows around Rmml's work seemed longer than ever. The hook came during his first week in the shattered city. A patrol from the U.S. Fifth Army discovered a satchel beneath the rubble of a half-destroyed post office near via Toledo. Inside were charred notebooks, maps annotated in English and Italian, and fragments of coded messages. When the bundle arrived at the temporary liaison office set up in a commandeered bank building, the aide recognized Rmml's handwriting on several pages. The date suggested the notes had been written weeks earlier, before Naples fell, implying that Rmml had maintained contacts in German-held territory long before most OSS teams were even briefed on infiltration routes. The struggle was not simply interpreting the fragments. It was the creeping suspicion that Rmml had operated outside formal authorization. One entry read, V. confirms movement of 16th Panzer remnants toward Caserta. Avoid established channels. The aide knew that V. likely referred to a local informant, possibly a dockworker, but the phrase, avoid established channels, suggested these communications had bypassed official reporting. Why would Rmml risk that? The aide wrestled with the implications as he sorted through more evidence of unsanctioned communication lines. His insight grew slowly as he pieced together scattered references. Several documents mentioned an unnamed Neapolitan financier who allegedly funded anti-German resistance cells but was also rumored to have collaborated with Italian fascists earlier in the war. Another memo referenced a safe house near Piazza del Mercato, known to both SOE and OSS, yet the address was absent from any formal operational registry. Whenever the aide cross-checked details with command, he encountered the same response: those records are incomplete, file as provisional. But he sensed a deeper story hidden beneath the official vagueness. The reveal came from an interview transcript recovered from another safe house. An Italian radio operator, captured by German forces but believed to have escaped, had spoken of a foreign officer who met him twice in the outskirts of Naples. The transcript described him as an American with a clipped tone, who refused all military insignia. The aide felt his breath tighten. The description fit Rmml almost exactly. Yet there was no formal report placing Rmml anywhere near Naples during the time frame in question. Then came the disappearance. An Italian resistance courier named Alessandro Ferri, known to SOE by the codename Lupo, met with Rmml for what was described as a brief logistical exchange in late October. Ferri had once acted as a guide for Allied infiltrators moving through the city's subterranean tunnels. The aide saw his name in conflicting reports multiple times over the previous months, a thread weaving through North Africa, Sicily, and now Italy. Hours after meeting Rmml, Ferri vanished. The official explanation: likely detained or executed by retreating German forces. But the timeline bothered the aide. Ferri's last documented location was deep inside Allied-controlled Naples. German patrols had not entered that district since their hurried withdrawal. When the aide brought the inconsistency to a senior OSS analyst, the analyst stiffened and spoke quietly. Not every disappearance can be investigated. Sometimes the work requires letting go of loose ends. The implication was clear: certain matters were meant to remain unexamined. The aide began keeping a separate, deeply private ledger. Not accusations, just questions. Why did Rmml's field notes omit references to Ferri? Why had his personal map from Sicily reappeared in a safe house in Naples? Why were some of his dispatches routed through secondary channels rather than official communications lines? Each question tightened the knot in his stomach. Modern readers might interpret this as a lesson in the complexities of irregular warfare. Intelligence work often relies on ambiguous relationships, shifting loyalties, and morally compromised alliances. But to the aide living through it, these were not theoretical dilemmas. They were choices with life-or-death consequences. He felt the crushing weight of responsibility in every coded message he handled, every map he restored, every whispered rumor that passed through the liaison office. The closing tension came one evening when Rmml finally returned to Naples after a 2-day absence. He entered the decoding room quietly, scanning the papers on the aide's desk. His gaze settled on the charred notebook fragments retrieved earlier. For the first time, the aide saw something that resembled concern flicker in Rmml's expression, just for a moment. "You've been thorough," Rmml said, voice low. "Almost too thorough." The aide felt a chill run down his spine. Rmml turned away, leaving behind only the faint scent of damp wool and cigarette smoke. And in the Aide's ledger, carefully hidden, trembling with unanswered questions, one more entry was added that night. Rmml knew Ferry's fate before any of us did. But no proof. Only shadows. The cost of knowing was beginning to reveal itself. By early 1944, the war along the Italian peninsula had settled into a grinding stalemate, but in the shadows behind the front lines, an entirely different battle was unfolding. A quiet, meticulous hunt for the source of intelligence leaks that had disrupted several Allied operations from Salerno to Naples. As word spread of an impending inquiry into unauthorized communications, the Aide found himself standing at the boundary between duty and dread. He had seen enough fragments, burned notebooks, conflicting field reports, vanished couriers, to suspect where the investigation might lead. But he also knew that Rmml had threaded himself into the fabric of OSS and SOE operations so tightly that removing a single piece could unravel everything. The hook came from a strange rumor circulating among British liaison officers. A coded transmission had been intercepted near Anzio, one that matched an Allied format but was broadcast on a German frequency. The message referenced supply depots and troop movements of the US Sixth Corps. When decrypted, it bore striking similarities to reports Rmml filed weeks earlier. The connection was circumstantial, but enough to rattle senior officers. The Aide, hearing fragments of these discussions in the corridors of the converted monastery where the liaison unit was now headquartered, felt a cold heaviness settle in his chest. The struggle intensified when internal auditors arrived from Allied force headquarters in Algiers. Their mission was simple: trace every unauthorized signal, every undocumented meeting, every unregistered courier movement. For the Aide, the days became an endless procession of questions. What had he filed? What had Rmml submitted directly? Why did some reports bear Rmml's signature but did not appear in the official registries? He answered honestly, but each reply tightened the noose of suspicion around his superior. Still, the formal questioning of Rmml surprised everyone with its brevity. He was summoned, interviewed for just under an hour behind closed doors, and released without comment. No charges, a major from the British staff whispered afterward, but they haven't cleared him either. The Aide found no relief in the outcome. If anything, it made the atmosphere more volatile, because if Rmml remained under suspicion, then anyone close to him was a potential liability, including the Aide. Insight came from a piece of overlooked evidence: Rmml's partially burned notebook recovered months earlier in Naples. The Aide had catalogued it in the official register, yet auditors claimed they had never seen it. When he checked the filing cabinet, the folder was gone. Only a thin layer of soot at the bottom of the drawer remained. The Aide realized two possibilities: someone had removed it to protect Rmml, or to protect themselves from what the notebook might confirm. Around this time, news arrived of a daring but disastrous operation near Cisterna. OSS teams had been tasked with infiltrating the German defensive line to support the Army Rangers advancing toward the town. The mission required precise timing, relying heavily on intelligence transmitted from an American officer operating independently near the front. The Aide recognized the description. Rmml had departed 2 days earlier, stating only that he was coordinating field adjustments. But the operation unraveled almost immediately. German forces ambushed the infiltration teams near the Pontine marshes. Survivors later reported that the rendezvous points had been compromised, as if the enemy had anticipated their movements. The Aide read the preliminary field reports with shaking hands. The reveal came that evening. A patrol from the 3rd Infantry Division returned with a grim discovery: a campsite hidden in a fold of terrain north of Cisterna, abandoned in haste. Among the scattered belongings, a torn map case, 2 spent signal flares, a dented water flask, lay fragments of a burnt leather notebook identical in style to Rmml's. There was no sign of its owner. Officers debated the meaning. Some believed Rmml had been killed or captured in the ambush. Others whispered darker possibilities, that he had vanished willingly, removing himself before the inquiry closed in. The Aide could neither accept nor dismiss any explanation. He stared at the smoke-stained fragments for hours, unable to reconcile the man he had worked under with the unanswered questions that now defined his legacy. A modern observer might say this demonstrates how the pressures of wartime command blur the line between sanctioned operations and unsanctioned improvisation. Yet for the Aide, standing amid the turmoil of Anzio, there was nothing abstract about it. Loyalty, once clear, had become a maze of duty, fear, and unresolved truth. He knew that the internal review would soon turn its attention back to him. He had processed Rmml's reports. He had seen documents that no longer existed. He had noticed discrepancies no one wanted to confront. The closing tension built as he prepared to leave the office one night. On his desk lay a sealed envelope, marked only with his name. Inside was a single sheet of paper, unsigned, unregistered, unmistakably typed on Rmml's machine. It contained only 4 words. "Burn what you know." The Aide sat alone in the dim light, the sounds of artillery echoing from the front. Rmml was gone. The truth was not. And the Aide knew Part 6 would demand a reckoning. One he might not survive unscathed. As winter bled into the spring of 1944, the war in Italy intensified, but for the Aide, the true battlefield had shifted inward. Rmml was gone, lost, vanished, or choosing to remain unseen, and in his absence, competing Allied branches began circling like quiet predators. OSS officers, SOE analysts, and military police investigators all wanted the same thing. The truth about Rmml's operations, the missing reports, and the Aide's involvement. Yet, truth in wartime was never a single tidy line. It was a mosaic of fragments, motives, and silences. And the Aide held fragments no one else possessed. The hook came during a morning briefing at the liaison compound. An American intelligence captain stepped into the room holding a folder stamped restricted, immediate. "A cache has been found," he announced, "near Cisterna, containing documents believed to relate to your former officer." The Aide's stomach clenched. The documents, he learned, were incomplete, half-burned reconnaissance sketches, rough operational outlines, and what appeared to be a coded message. None bore Rmml's full name, of course, but the handwriting was unmistakable. More alarming was the revelation that 3 separate Allied commands had copies of different portions of the cache. No one trusted the others to interpret it alone. The struggle unfolded quietly but relentlessly. Officers began requesting interviews with the Aide, sometimes under the guise of clarification, other times as outright interrogation. One SOE official pressed him, "Did Rmml ever mention alternate reporting channels?" Another asked if he had seen any signs of unauthorized contacts in Naples. The Aide answered honestly where he could, and cautiously where he must. His greatest fear was not accusation, but misinterpretation. Anything he said could become ammunition for a narrative he did not control. Insight arrived unexpectedly in the form of an overlooked page from Rmml's earlier documents. While reviewing the cache under supervision, the Aide recognized a familiar cipher pattern from the Sicilian operations. Beneath a column of numbers was a brief annotation, "Cross-check sources before transmission." It was a simple instruction, almost mundane, but it suggested something crucial. Rmml had been verifying intelligence through parallel networks, perhaps to filter out deliberate German disinformation. This raised a provocative question. Had Rmml's actions been rogue or protective? But the reveal that truly shook the Aide came days later, delivered in a drab envelope by a British courier. Inside were copies of intercepted German reports from early 1944. One entry described an American liaison officer operating beyond authorized zones, whom they believed was seeking to disrupt German counterintelligence traps. Another noted that this officer evaded capture near Cisterna, but left behind destroyed documents. The Aide felt the breath leave his lungs. The Germans had been hunting Rmml not because he was careless, but because he was effective. Still, the mystery had only deepened. If Rmml had survived the ambush, where had he gone? And why no message, no confirmation, no instruction beyond the cryptic "burn what you know"? The Aide turned these questions over obsessively. his loyalty torn between the man he had served and the commands now demanding answers. A modern analyst might frame this as a lesson about the delicate nature of counterintelligence, that effective officers often operate at the edge of sanction, blurring lines to keep others safe. But these conclusions offered little comfort to the aide. He grappled with the reality of what Rmml's disappearance meant, for the war effort, for accountability, and for the men whose lives had intersected with the Americans' risky choices. As the days passed, pressure mounted. One evening, an OSS colonel informed him that he would need to surrender all materials in his possession. Notes, observations, even personal correspondence. For consolidation, the colonel said. But the aide had already hidden his private ledger, the one containing every inconsistency he had ever recorded. He knew that once the documents left his hands, the narrative would belong entirely to others. Rmml would become whatever legend, or liability, those officials decided he had been. And so, he made a decision. He would write his own account. Not an accusation. Not a defense. A testimony. He waited until the compound quieted, then sat in the decoding room with only a dim lamp illuminating the desk. He opened a fresh notebook and began writing from the beginning. North Africa, Sicily, Naples, the disappearances, the field fragments, the contradictions. He wrote of Ferry's fate, of the map with alternate rendezvous points, of the charred notebooks, and of the final message left behind near Cisterna. Each page became a confession, not only of what he knew, but of what he failed to question in time. When he finished, dawn was breaking over the rooftops. He signed his name only once, at the end of the manuscript, as though acknowledging the personal responsibility entwined with every revelation. His hands trembled slightly as he closed the notebook. He did not know who would read his account, or how it would shape Rmml's legacy, or his own. But he knew this: the truth, whatever it was, could no longer be buried in sealed pouches and burned fragments. And as he delivered the manuscript to the Secure Records Office that morning, he accepted a final unsettling thought. Some loyalties in war are never fully repaid. And some confessions come only when time itself begins to run out.